Lead 6300 Leadership and Decision Making, Lang School of Business Economics at the University of Guelph. Group 4 presentation Roxana Carmen, Lynn Marie Farley, Liz Hastings, Liz Lingo, and Julie Malone. Don Cherry joined CBC's Hockey Night in Canada in 1980 as a sports analyst, later becoming the star of CBC's Coach's Corner in 1982. Throughout the past decade, it was common for Don to head off on a tangent during his program with topics outside of hockey. Often he found himself in trouble with viewers for stating his blunt views. This unapologetic personality became part of his brand along with his garish suits. Quickly became an icon of the Canadian hockey landscape. An example is off-color commentary. In 2007, Don found himself in hot water after commenting, "Fair shake in life, go out and get your own fair shake in life and work for it. Don't give me that stuff," in reference to Chris Simon, a hockey player for the Ojibwe community. On November 9th, 2019, Don Cherry found himself in a firestorm of social media controversy after commenting, "You love your way of life, you love our milk and honey, at least you could pay a couple of bucks for a poppy," or something like that. "These guys pay for your way of life that you enjoy in Canada. These guys paid the biggest price," Cherry said, emphasizing the "you" with numerous finger jabs at the camera. The backlash from the public was swift, with many complaints to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. This number of complaints overloaded their system, requiring the CBSC to release the following statement. The CBSC has received a large number of very similar complaints concerning Coach's Corner broadcast on CBC Sportsnet on November 9, 2019. To ensure that all complaints are dealt with efficiently and in a timely manner, the CBSC limits the number of complaints it will accept in respect of the same broadcast. The CBSC process does not vary based on the number of complaints made. The same consideration is given to one single valid complaint as to multiple complaints on the same matter. The CBSC is now dealing with the comments made on Coach's Corner under its normal process. As a result, no further complaints will be accepted by the CBSC on this issue. Based on the quick public response, Sportsnet released an initial statement denouncing Don Cherry's tangent. Don Cherry's discriminatory comments are offensive and they do not represent our values and what we stand for as a network. We have spoken with Don about the severity of this issue and we sincerely apologize for these divisive remarks. Bart Yabsley, President, Sportsnet. The National Hockey League released their own statement based on Don Cherry's association with their own brand and the relationship between Coach's Corner and the hockey community. Hockey is at its best when it brings people together. The comments made last night were offensive and contrary to the values we believe. Despite the apologies from the organizations associated with the Coach's Corner, Don Cherry had yet to publicly apologize. This further caused division amongst the hockey and the Canadian community. The social media backlash was quick, with many calling Don Cherry a racist, pointing out his history of prejudicial remarks and calling upon Sportsnet to fire him from his position. Don Cherry was known to be passionate about the Canadian Forces men and women, however many people were calling him out on his lack of military service. Canadians were incensed that his comments targeted one specific population, those who had just immigrated to Canada, and not all Canadians who were failing to wear poppies. Ultimately, as one Twitter follower pointed out, Sportsnet needed to start thinking about whether Don Cherry and his divisive comments were fitting with the brand. Don Cherry, during this time, continued to sit silent, with a refusal to provide a comment or an apology. November 11th, 2019, Sportsnet released the following statement. Sports bring people together. It unites us, not divides us. Following further discussion with Don Cherry after Saturday night's broadcast, it has been decided it's the right time for him to immediately step down. During the broadcast, he made divisive remarks that do not represent our values or what we stand for. Don is synonymous with hockey and has played an integral role in growing the game over the past 40 years. We'd like to thank Don for his contributions to hockey and sports broadcasting in Canada. Bart Yabsley, President, Sportsnet. In an interview with Toronto Sun News, Don Cherry shared that he'd been fired from Sportsnet for his comments made on Coach's Corner. Cherry, unapologetic, stated, "I know what he said. I meant it. Everyone in Canada should wear a poppy to honor fallen soldiers." Cherry said his words were not racial or bigoted, but patriotic and respectful of our troops. "To keep my job, I cannot be turned into a tamed robot." Still, he admits being fired on Remembrance Day does hurt because I would have liked to continue doing Coach's Corner. "The problem is, if I have to watch everything I say, it isn't Coach's Corner." Post-firing, social media had many in support of Don Cherry's firing and wondering why it had not happened before based on his history of xenophobic and prejudicial comments. There's also those on the other side who were increasingly verbal about their support for Don Cherry. Twitter handles I support Don Cherry, I support Don, cancel Sportsnet, boycott Sportsnet quickly flying across the net. This decision led to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council being overwhelmed for a second time in a week, forcing them to release a second statement. The CBSC has also received a large number of complaints about Sportsnet's decision to fire Don Cherry. The CBSC was not involved in that decision. The CBSC has no jurisdiction over the employment or operation matters of its member stations, nor can it require a station to remove an on-air host. The CBSC will not be accepting any additional complaints on this topic. The CBSC has not yet issued a decision on Don Cherry's remarks on Coach's Corner of November 9th. Ultimately, Don Cherry created a firestorm of controversy and brought forth a discussion of the urban and rural divide of those who are conservative and those who are liberal, or as Don Cherry called those liberals in 2010, left-wing blinkos. In a statement released to the press, Sportsnet President Bart Rabsley commented that Cherry's statement does not reflect the values of the organization. In analyzing Sportsnet's decision, it's vital to examine the factors which may have been at play, including bias and pattern recognition. An examination of such factors will allow us to explore the realities which exist within this decision and the forces that could have impacted the network's swift action following Cherry's comments. Cherry has been known to push boundaries with his commentary. The longtime broadcaster has been known to ruffle feathers on Coach's Corner segment with little to no blowback until now. This leads us to the question, why did the network decide to take action now? Social media and Canada's political stance as it relates to immigration are important factors to consider. The social context in which we live, and the fact that Canada is a country committed to meeting the country's labor market needs through immigration, as well as a commitment to reuniting families and offering protection to displaced people. The backlash online and on social media demanding Cherry face the consequences of his words played a significant role. The decision of Sportsnet to fire Don Cherry also represented loss aversion. The network needed to consider the impact of the comments on business, including viewership as well as revenue generating from advertising. Connected to loss aversion is self-interest on the part of the organization. And making the decision to distance themselves from Cherry and his inflammatory comments, the organization was also demonstrating that high value on sports being unifying, as well as the high value placed on the company's reputation. Let's consider how pattern recognition may have also played a role in the Sportsnet's decision to fire Don Cherry. We know this is not the first time Don Cherry has made controversial comments on his Coach's Corner segment. Pattern recognition may have caused decision makers to use similar instances where Don Cherry used his platform to push boundaries and make controversial comments. This information would have helped the decision makers arrive at their final decision. Additionally, the media plays an important role on how society makes meaning of various identities and communities in the country. Canada is known as a country that is welcoming to immigrants with its policies reflecting values, placing importance on welcoming new immigrants who enrich the Canadian economy and the culture. The decision of Sportsnet to fire a Canadian celebrity with such strong ties to a Canadian sports community reflects how the company may have been trying to salvage its reputation and values to the generalized public and not just the sports community. So on the last slide, we discussed that there were significant amount of incidents that took place, and that may have led to pattern recognition that the Sportsnet officials used to make the decision to fire him. Throughout the 33 seasons of Coach's Corner, Don Cherry had many controversial moments during his impassioned political tangents. But I think it's important to recognize that few triggered such strong public recourse until November 9th, 2019. So to talk a little bit about Cherry and about his decision making, Cherry exhibited a number of misleading prejudgments and biases during his years on Coach's Corner, and he used it as a platform to express his strong opinions on multiple occasions. From this perspective, Cherry showed a misleading prejudgment when he asserted only immigrants are not wearing Remembrance Day poppies to acknowledge those who died in the line of duty during the wars. He wrongly assumed that immigrants don't show respect to those heroes because they had no ties to those who fought. Potentially, this misleading prejudgment may have come from past emotional tags related to immigrants who had not shown respect to the Canadian culture and their traditions. Cherry may also have been showing a strong anchoring bias, potentially based on immigrants' skin color, accent, or their dress. This bias could also come from his generation's perceptions during a time when diversity and multiculturalism were still young in Canada, and perhaps when he was not as exposed to it, as diversity has certainly grown in Canada over the past decades. As mentioned, Don Cherry has a history of discrimination and stereotyping, but he does not have the self awareness of his explicit racial bias. So he demonstrates dissent towards immigrants that don't share his same viewpoints, and Don Cherry has demonstrated very public instances where his prejudgment is evident. He's made up his mind about the diverse population, thus, it's really hard to change his views. So, due to the confirmation bias, he looks for evidence that supports his views and really disavows information that doesn't support his views. So, unfortunately, his comments were very kind of polarizing amongst his followers. In this ideal situation, Sportsnet could have taken a proactive approach with Coach's Corner. So the leaders were aware of the importance of Remembrance Day and the importance of veterans to Don Cherry, and they were also aware of the past history of Don Cherry had insulting immigrants. Having this knowledge and experience, it really was a red flag for Sportsnet. And Sportsnet had the opportunity to caution Don Cherry to choose his words wisely, especially in public and on public television, and request that Don Cherry provide his dialogue in advance of airing. And having understanding of the potential consequences of Don Cherry's bias, they would have avoided a lot of the controversy that arose. So Sportsnet failed to use the opportunity to help Don Cherry acknowledge his bias and stereotyping of immigrants, and appropriately advise him to try to avoid the situation. So Sportsnet reacted quickly to Don Cherry's public comments by dismissing Don Cherry and canceling Coach's Corner. Their concern regarding the impact to the network influenced their decision-making abilities. Senior leaders perceived that they were dealing with a high-risk issue necessitating a quick decision. In addition, the quick decision was intended to send a strong message to the viewers and disassociate themselves with Don Cherry's beliefs. But did their self-interest prompt them to make a flawed decision? A quick decision is necessary in these instances. However, ensuring the decision-making process is rational will ensure the consequences of the decision is manageable. The PROACT model would have been helpful to these goals. Sportsnet was in damage control mode, and consideration of the following key elements would have increased the credibility of their apology. So, sincerity of the apology to communicate regret with the actions for maintaining Cherry's Coach's Corner when other networks would have canceled him. Who delivered the apology? So it's usually best delivered by a CEO or president, and Sportsnet had this element because their president delivered the messaging. The speed of the apology, so acting quickly demonstrates the commitment of the organization. But you have to keep in mind the speed of the apology is insufficient in isolation of the message being delivered. So, thinking of our scenario, the apology by Sportsnet gave the impression that they were sorry, but in actual fact, the company was actually trying to regain their control by reminding the viewers of their own values. And so this was actually an example of loss aversion bias. And so, how is the apology delivered? So that's important too. So you have to be, by using informal language and personal communication is actually more effective. It improves the sincerity of the apology. And then the viewers and the general public are able to relate those emotions expressed and identify with the president. While a written apology, which is what Sportsnet used, strikes a different tone, and it lacks that emotional tagging and increases that risk of perceived self-interest bias. And there's commitment to change. So Sportsnet neglected to communicate how they were going to change when they broadcasted the apology. They then appeared to have a knee-jerk reaction when they fired Don Cherry in light of that public outcry. So a pre-moratorium of public reaction would have improved the sequence of events, increasing the organization's credibility in the eyes of the public. So, unfortunately, Sportsnet also chose a one plan at a time approach, and that actually led to a pretty negative public response overall for them. So other options were available to Sportsnet to better manage the situation. So a public apology. So we do know that Don Cherry refused the opportunity to apologize. He indicated he felt he did not stereotype immigrants, and I think it's pretty apparent he demonstrates a lack of self-awareness associated with the situation. Um, However, Sportsnet could have taken a proactive approach to reframe the apology, using a conscious effort to avoid cognitive distortion of loss aversion. So to maintain Don Cherry's dignity, which I think was real lacking, as he's quite a proud man, and part of his persona is to not apologize. They could have offered him options from a public awareness standpoint. So he could have educated the public on the importance of Remembrance Day and the significance of the symbolism associated with the poppy, but also to continue to address the issue of the perceived racism and the unethical behavior that Don Cherry displayed, including the information that recognize the impact and the contributions immigrants have had throughout Canada's history, specifically in the wars, and by issuing a public statement that could have neutralized the negative outcome. So these steps would have reframed the contentious issue into one that promoted unity amongst the diverse population. So, as Don Cherry was an important contributor and very much a polarizing figure to the sports world, a form of apology that includes awareness of the racism that was apparent would have created an environment promoting advocacy for soldiers serving in the military, regardless of race and gender. And I think the public would have rallied behind Don Cherry due to his influential abilities, and instead of breaking bridges, which has obviously happened and kind of made this divisive problem right now, those who support Don Cherry and those don't, it probably would have actually brought people together and made those who have, biases that they're not aware of be more aware of the potential biases that they hold.
Although hosting in a group of two with Ron MacLean, the latter showed a groupthink bias, where Cherry was the one who was able to influence the content of the show and digress from sports hockey to politics without even being questioned by his colleague and friend. Ron MacLean, by not reacting to Don Cherry's statement, instead giving it the thumbs up, showed support for Don Cherry's message. Ron MacLean later was required to issue a public apology on air and announce the end of Coach's Corner. Ron MacLean's apology appeared sincere, however, fans of Don Cherry perceived that Ron demonstrated self-interest bias by betraying his best friend. As discussed with the Sportsnet apology, Ron MacLean would have improved the credibility of his apology. He could have indicated what steps he would take to correct the situation or prevent it in the future. This additional action would have improved the effectiveness of his apology. The actions of Cherry and Sportsnet have been polarizing. The moment on Coach's Corner has ignited the nation. Debate was fast and furious on both sides of the fence. It became clear Canadians are not unified with their views on immigrants and their place in our society. Cherry stayed firm on his stance that he should not apologize, despite the backlash and many viewpoints to the contrary. It was not until a video interview with CBC posted on November 12, 2019, that Cherry admitted that he should have addressed everyone. When the interview asked if he'd made a mistake, Cherry responded, "If you want to say mistake, it was a mistake. But I think the big thing was I should have said everyone. That was the big thing." The interview queried if Cherry was asked to apologize, and Cherry glossed it over this, indicating they could not agree on what would occur. Cherry seemingly continues to have little insight into the impact his words have had on Canadians. Many have criticized the firing, blaming cancel culture. In an interview with CBC, Toronto psychologist Dr. Amate noticed the culture provides this illusion of power, of control, of virtue to the ones performing the canceling. The principle is that an individual can be shut out when they do something the internet populace thinks is offensive. Amate compares this to getting a high. He noticed this avoidance of an issue has prevented the ability to discuss important topics. It was reported that not long after Cherry's segment, Twitter, Cherry Must Go, and Fire Don Cherry were trending. Budweiser, official sponsor, was also quick to condemn the comments. The Royal Canadian Legion also condemned the rant. Those affected by Cherry's words have written about the impact of our refusal to deal with racism. One individual wrote of his brother's experience as a young hockey player of color in the 80s. He was constantly assaulted with the N word. This was accompanied by intimidation tactics off the ice, not just by players, but by parents. This led to his early departure from the sport. Post-firing of Cherry, many immigrants to Canada posted images and messages of how their families supported war efforts. Most notably, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. The issue of our identity inclusiveness has been highlighted by this issue. In the wake of this decision, another opinion TV host, Just Allen of The Social, found herself in hot water. In her commentary, she described hockey players as a certain type of person who tends to be white boys who weren't, let's say, very nice, going on to call them bullies. Soon, calls for Allen's dismissal began to mirror Cherry's story. In fact, it was reported she had to make her Instagram account private as a result of the response. Allen, however, apologized. CTV made a statement of apology, yet Allen was not dismissed. CTV's position was related to the fact that Allen was a co-host of an opinion show, and this was relevant to share her personal opinion.
Some argue that Cherry served a purpose to start discussions about important issues. An example occurred in 2004 when anti-Francophone comments on the program sparked debate in the House of Commons. In an interview with Global News' Stephen Prowell, a Canadian historian, discussed his views. He states firing and apologies don't always work, because what they don't do is tell the whole story. To my mind, the best possible thing that could have happened was for him to have invited someone more informed on the show and use his platform to correct what he said. Sportsnet had a responsibility to make a decision in the face of significant backlash in the era of Me Too movement and increased awareness of social responsibility. Cherry's history of controversial comments could no longer be ignored. An article on marketing ethics suggests that the more serious the ethical dilemma or serious the issue, the more likely the judgment will be ethically positive. Sportsnet came to a decision that may have been influenced by self-interest and law separation, but they would have needed to react in an ethical manner as well. When considering the issue highlighted as the center of this controversy, ethnocentrism may be factored in. It can be described, and the perception that ways are familiar to us are good, and other ways that are considered less desirable or bad. The risk is that most often one is not even aware of this perception. Us and them become part of our thought patterns. Cherry's Rent has highlighted the existence of this belief in Canada, a purportedly multicultural society. An article by Ethical Leadership by Messick and Bazerman indicate to remove ethnocentrism from decision making, Sportsnet had to frame the decision not from the us or them, but to consider a more inclusive we. They decided to remove Cherry, but an opportunity to open dialogue and change perception has been